the total liberation of Ukraine may have just begun. Across the Eastern Front, something significant is unfolding, something that military observers have been quietly warning about for weeks. What we are witnessing right now does not look like a routine counterattack or a small tactical push to reclaim a few villages. Instead, the movements along the front suggest the opening phase of something far larger, a coordinated and determined offensive that could reshape the trajectory of the war. For months, the battlefield appeared locked in a brutal stalemate. Russian forces continued their grinding advances in several sectors of eastern Ukraine, especially in the Donbass region, while Ukrainian troops focused on holding defensive lines, relying on drones, artillery, and long-range strikes to slow Russia's momentum. To outside observers, the war looked frozen, an endless war of attrition where both sides traded blows, but neither gained decisive ground. But beneath that apparent stalemate, something else was happening. Preparations were quietly underway. Units were being rotated and repositioned. Ammunition depots were being stocked. New technologies were introduced into combat units. And perhaps most importantly, Ukrainian commanders were carefully studying the weaknesses that had begun to appear in Russia's frontline structure. Now, suddenly, the tempo of the war is changing. Reports emerging from the battlefield indicate that Ukrainian forces have launched coordinated operations across several key sectors. These operations involve airborne units, mechanized brigades, specialized assault teams, and large numbers of drones providing real-time intelligence. The goal is not simply to push Russian troops back temporarily, but to systematically dismantle the defensive framework that Russia has been building for more than a year. The first phase of this campaign appears to focus on areas that Russia had hoped to transform into defensive buffer regions that would shield its occupied territories and protect its future offensive operations. Moscow's strategy relied on gradually expanding control outward, creating layered defensive zones that could absorb Ukrainian counterattacks and buy time for Russian forces to fortify their gains in the Donbass. But that plan is now under pressure. Instead of allowing Russia to consolidate these buffer zones, Ukraine has begun targeting them directly. Ukrainian reconnaissance drones have been scanning Russian positions for weeks, mapping trenches, supply routes, artillery sites, and command centers. Once those weak points are identified, Ukrainian artillery and drone strikes move in first, degrading Russian defenses before ground forces advance. This methodical approach has become a defining feature of Ukraine's modern battlefield strategy. Small reconnaissance drones fly above Russian positions, transmitting live video feeds to Ukrainian command centers. These feeds allow commanders to monitor enemy movements in real time and identify exactly where Russian defenses are weakest. Then come the precision strikes. Artillery units and loitering munitions begin targeting Russian supply trucks, ammunition storage sites, and communication hubs. These strikes are designed to create confusion and disrupt coordination among Russian units. Once those disruptions begin to take effect, Ukrainian assault teams move forward, often supported by armored vehicles and mechanized infantry. This combination of aerial surveillance, long-range strikes, and rapid ground assaults has allowed Ukraine to challenge Russian positions that once appeared firmly entrenched. And perhaps most importantly, these operations are not happening in just one place. Multiple sectors of the front are experiencing increased pressure simultaneously. This forces Russian commanders into a difficult strategic dilemma. If they reinforce one threatened sector, another sector may suddenly become vulnerable. If they attempt to hold every position with limited manpower, their defensive lines risk becoming overstretched. This is precisely the kind of situation Ukraine appears to be trying to create. Modern warfare is not always about dramatic breakthroughs or sweeping armored advances. Sometimes it is about slowly eroding the enemy's ability to maintain control. By launching coordinated operations across several areas, Ukraine is forcing Russia to spread its forces thinner and thinner. And that is where the offensive begins to show its real strategic impact. Russia's long-term objective in this war remains the complete capture of the Donbass region. Cities like Slavyansk and Kramatorsk represent the last major Ukrainian defensive strongholds in that area. If Russia were able to seize them, it would fundamentally alter the strategic balance of the war. But achieving that goal requires enormous resources. Russian forces must maintain constant artillery fire, supply tens of thousands of troops, and reinforce offensive units with fresh soldiers and equipment. Any disruption to that logistical network can slow Russia's advance dramatically. By launching counteroffensives in key sectors, Ukraine is forcing Russia to divert attention and resources away from its main offensive objectives. Instead of concentrating entirely on advancing into Donetsk, Russian commanders now have to reinforce threatened areas and stabilize defensive lines that were previously considered secure. Another factor that is reshaping the battlefield is the rapid evolution of drone warfare. Over the past 2 years, Ukraine has transformed drones from a supplementary tool into one of the most important components of its military strategy. Reconnaissance drones now operate almost constantly along the front, giving Ukrainian forces an unprecedented level of battlefield awareness. But surveillance is only part of the story. Ukraine has also developed extensive fleets of strike drones capable of targeting armored vehicles, artillery pieces, and supply convoys. Some of these drones are small and inexpensive, but incredibly effective. Others are larger, long-range systems capable of striking deep behind Russian lines. These capabilities are placing enormous pressure on Russia's logistical infrastructure, fuel depots, ammunition warehouses, and transportation hubs that once operated safely in rear areas are now increasingly vulnerable to drone strikes. Every successful strike forces Russia to move supplies further away from the front lines, increasing the time and difficulty required to sustain combat operations. In war, logistics are everything. An army can only fight as long as it can deliver ammunition, fuel, food, and reinforcements to the battlefield. When those supply lines are disrupted, even the strongest frontline positions can become vulnerable. This is one of the reasons Ukraine's current offensive is attracting so much attention among military analysts. It is not just about reclaiming territory. It is about attacking the structural foundations that support Russia's military presence in Ukraine. Another important development is the growing flexibility of Ukrainian combat units. Early in the war, Ukraine often relied heavily on defensive positions and static fortifications. Today, many Ukrainian brigades have become far more mobile, capable of shifting rapidly between defensive and offensive roles. Units that once focused on holding the line are now participating in coordinated assaults. Mechanized brigades that were previously stationed as defensive forces have been redeployed to support offensive operations. This adaptability allows Ukraine to exploit opportunities quickly whenever Russian defenses show signs of weakness. At the same time, Russian forces are facing increasing challenges of their own. Maintaining a massive front line stretching hundreds of kilometers requires enormous manpower. Russian units must defend trenches, patrol supply routes, man artillery batteries, and operate air defense systems all simultaneously. Over time, this constant demand for personnel can stretch even a large military force to its limits. Reports from the battlefield suggest that Russia has already begun redeploying additional units to stabilize certain sectors. These movements indicate that Ukrainian pressure is forcing Russian commanders to adjust their plans, and those adjustments may come at a cost. If Russia is forced to redirect troops from its planned offensives in the Donbass, its ability to achieve major breakthroughs could be significantly reduced. Instead of concentrating overwhelming force on a single objective, Russian commanders may find themselves constantly reacting to Ukrainian moves across the front. This shift in initiative is one of the most important aspects of the current situation. For much of the past year, Russia has been able to dictate the pace of the war. Ukrainian forces were often forced into defensive positions, responding to Russian advances and trying to minimize losses while waiting for opportunities to counterattack. Now, that dynamic appears to be changing. Ukraine is increasingly taking the initiative in choosing where to attack, when to apply pressure, and how to force Russia into difficult strategic decisions. Of course, large-scale offensives are never simple or predictable. Battlefield conditions can change rapidly. Weather, terrain, and logistics all influence how quickly troops can move and how effectively they can fight.
Russia
a successful offensive requires careful coordination and constant adaptation, but the early indicators suggest that Ukraine's current operations are not random or improvised. They appear to be part of a deliberate campaign designed to weaken Russia's defensive system step by step. Every isolated Russian position that collapses creates new opportunities for Ukrainian forces to advance. Every disrupted supply route increases pressure on Russian frontline units, and every kilometer of territory reclaimed sends a powerful message about the changing momentum of the war. For Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines, these operations represent more than just tactical maneuvers. They represent the possibility of reclaiming land that has been under occupation for years. Each advance carries enormous symbolic importance for a nation that has endured immense destruction and hardship since the war began. Meanwhile, international observers are watching closely. Support from Western allies remains a critical factor in Ukraine's ability to sustain large-scale operations. Military aid, intelligence sharing, and financial assistance have helped Ukraine maintain its defense and develop the technological capabilities that now play such a central role in its strategy. If Ukraine's offensive continues to gain momentum, it could strengthen political support for continued assistance from allied nations. Conversely, any major setbacks could encourage calls for negotiations or a reduction in support. This broader geopolitical context means that every development on the battlefield has implications far beyond the front lines. For now, the early stages of Ukraine's offensive suggest that the war may be entering a new phase. Instead of remaining locked in a slow war of attrition, the conflict is beginning to show signs of renewed maneuver and strategic competition. Both sides are searching for opportunities to gain the upper hand, and the coming months could prove decisive. What began as a desperate struggle for survival has gradually evolved into a prolonged contest of endurance and strategy. And now, with Ukrainian forces launching coordinated operations across key sectors, the possibility of significant territorial changes is once again on the horizon. Whether this campaign ultimately leads to sweeping breakthroughs or remains a series of gradual advances remains to be seen. War rarely unfolds exactly as planners expect. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The front lines are moving again. And if the momentum we are seeing today continues to build, the campaign now underway could mark the beginning of a new chapter in the war in which Ukraine is not merely defending its territory, but actively pushing forward in a determined effort to reclaim it. The total liberation of Ukraine may not happen overnight, but the offensive that has just begun suggests that the struggle for that goal is entering a decisive new stage.
It wreaks havoc with whatever plans Russia has for its manpower. We mentioned earlier that one of Russia's goals for its buffer zone was to force Ukraine to divert more of its resources to Dnipropetrovsk, forcing the creation of opportunities in the Donbass and perhaps elsewhere in Ukraine. Instead, what Ukraine has done is use small aerial and ground assault units, along with mechanized units and swarms of drones, to conduct a systematic search and destroy operation in Dnipropetrovsk that has wrested back control of territory that we now know is only loosely held by small gaggles of Russian infiltration units. With that job practically done, Ukraine has turned the tables. It's not Ukraine that has to divert resources, it's Russia. Komarenko explains what this means for Russia when discussing Ukraine's gains in Dnipropetrovsk and the Alexandrivsk axis. The most difficult sectors remain Pokrovsk and Alexandrivsk, when the enemy has concentrated its main efforts, but we are gradually stabilizing the situation thanks to our active actions, Komarenko reports per United 24 media. He adds, the number of enemy attacks around Pokrovsk and Mirnorad has somewhat decreased as their forces were redirected toward the Alexandrivsk axis. In other words, Putin has been forced to push troops that he intended to use to capture key territory in Donetsk back toward an axis that he thought was safe. That wasn't the plan. It was all meant to be the other way around, thanks to the buffer that no longer exists. And what this all means is that Russia is now going to have to burn through soldiers that were sent into Ukraine for the push into Donetsk on another operation entirely. That's the last thing that Putin wants when Russia is already struggling to obtain the manpower that it needs to conduct the offensives that it has planned for the spring and summer. As the Moscow Times reported on March 2nd, Russia is getting so desperate to bolster its ranks that it started sending letters to the parents of young women from the Central Asian region. Those letters contain an offer for the daughters of those parents, for whom Russia is willing to pay $26,000 in return for 1 year of military service. And to compound Russia's desperation, These offers are being made to young women from Asia who are serving prison sentences, meaning Putin is specifically targeting those he sees as vulnerable to try to bring more people into his fight. This is the sort of thing that a country that is clearly winning a war would never have to do. Women don't typically serve on the front lines for Russia, though the country has mobilized some female soldiers in the past to serve as medical personnel. So the fact that Russia is making these sorts of offers to the parents of convicts, don't forget, tells us that it's not getting its hands on the soldiers and support personnel that it needs in Ukraine. That probably has something to do with the fact that Ukraine is now eliminating more soldiers each month than Russia is able to recruit, which has basically led to Putin deciding that he will take anybody that he can get to maintain the illusion of Russian control. That illusion has been shattered by the Dnipropetrovsk counteroffensive. Ukraine has played this all masterfully. It's taken advantage of Russian weakness in Dnipropetrovsk to liberate territory that Putin thought he held. Now, Putin has to divert troops back to the buffer he thought he created, which means more losses on the front and less manpower in the Donbass. And as all of this is happening, Russia is growing more desperate for manpower while Ukraine becomes terrifyingly efficient at wiping that manpower off the map. The spring and summer are starting to shape up to be a failure for Russia. At this point, Putin must be used to that. After all, his forces have utterly failed to stop any of this from happening. Ukraine's counteroffensive isn't some sort of flash maneuver that it pulled off in a matter of hours. Ukraine has been retaking territory for weeks in a concerted campaign that began in earnest in early February. We covered the very beginning of what we're seeing now in a video, so check that out if you want to learn more. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to The Military Show so you never miss our coverage of the Ukraine war. And thank you for watching.